You're listening to The Briefing, first broadcast on the 20th of May, 2024 on Monocle Radio. Hello and welcome to The Briefing, live from Studio One here at Midori House in London. I'm Chris Chermak. Coming up on today's programme, Iran declares 5 days of mourning after the death of its president in a helicopter crash. We'll look at Ebrahim Raisi's legacy and the path forward for Iran. Also ahead. Georgia's parliament vows to override a presidential veto of its controversial foreign agents law. We'll look at the state of protests on the ground in Tbilisi. We'll also check in on the start of the fifth round of India's elections. We'll hear from Poland on why the country is spending billions to protect its eastern flank. And finally, we'll go through the day's newspapers in Latin America with Monocle's Fernando Augusto Pacheco. What have you found for us today, Faye?
Hello, Chris. Today we talk about Brazil's presence in Cannes and the latest spat between Spain and Argentina.
All that right here on The Briefing with me, Chris Chermak. Iran as a state is in mourning after its president, Ebrahim Raisi, was killed in a helicopter crash on Sunday along with the country's foreign minister. But for a leader who was also the architect of repeatedly brutal crackdowns on protesters, well, it's fair to say the feelings among Iran's people today will be somewhat mixed. The question now is what and who comes next, and whether anything will really change in an autocratic nation where the supreme leader is the one with any real power. Let's get more on this now with Negin Shiragai, who's an Iranian activist and entrepreneur and a former news presenter at the BBC's Persian service. Negin, it's great to have you on the show. What was your reaction to the news?
Oh my God, Chris, it was, I have this conflicted feeling to talk about what happened yesterday to non-Iranian audience, because I think it's quite complicated for people who haven't lived under that much of oppression for so long to understand the creativity and the kind of like a jokes that are going around. But it was laughing all day and reading people's reaction to Raisi's missing and then his death, because it was a variety of reactions in all happy reactions to his been missing. There were like a lot of underlying comparison between the patriarchal system and people's reaction, and women were happy, and and seeing people being that happy, it made me happy. And it was like going through X, former Twitter, up and down, and reading this and the following news through that. So yeah, I'm not sure if that's understandable for a non-Iranian, but Iranians for the first time in years were really happy all around the world, and they were sharing their happiness. There were like fireworks in different cities in Tehran and some Kurdistan cities. They were like dancing on the streets. People were having shots. There were news of sweet shops, running out of sweets, and in general, I can say with confidence that the majority of people were celebrating the missing of the president and the death, as well as the foreign minister, because of their past, as you mentioned in the beginning.
I mean, again, it is quite an incredible reaction to have in a situation like this, although exactly as you explain it, for Iran's people, given the oppression that they are under, it is certainly understandable. I wonder what you feel like the remaining regime will think of that. Are you worried? Are you expecting a sort of crackdown on the reaction to this news?
The crackdown has already started. So since yesterday, there were this, kind of like a paper from the government saying anyone who's writing and reacting to this news in a bad way, we're going to arrest them. And there has been numerous accounts of known journalists or people who have some kind of like a being known for their presence or being activists, that they had to delete the tweets and the reactions from social media because they've been called and contacted by the intelligence ministry telling them, take this off or we're going to take you to prison. So it has started, but I think that the number of reactions were so much that they would try to bring down some of them, but it's impossible to bring down all of these tweets and reactions from social media. And people are like Bluetoothing it, like sending it to each other on Telegram and different social media channels. And there's a limitation on the oppression when it's happening, in this scale. I'm not sure how much they can continue doing that. And the Iranians managed to, throughout years, to learn how to celebrate away from the eyes of the government. We've seen it during different incidents in Iran throughout the last 4 decades.
And Negin, I just wonder, from your perspective, if you could reflect a little more on, I guess, Ebrahim Raisi's legacy for you. What is his legacy going to be? Of course, particularly with the crackdowns that we've talked about. What in your eye is his legacy from Iran?
I think for me and a lot of other Iranians, what happened during the 1980s in Iran, and especially his role as one of the judges in the committee that was sentencing more than 4,000 people estimated to death within 1 year, is something that stays with Iranians all the time. He was the head of the judiciary system for a while, and during that time, the human rights in prisons declined massively, and there were like so many corrupt ways of getting the funding and money out of the judiciary system. There were big cases of corruption in that organization. But the thing is, like, he becoming the president, and then his name coming up a lot within, especially inside Iran, as a potential replacement for the Khamenei after the supreme leader after his death. It was there, but nobody took him seriously. So even within, after the Jina Mahsamini's death in 2022 and the massive protests that happened inside Iran, he wasn't mentioned in the slogans against the government. Everyone knew that he didn't have any power, and he was just there because he wasn't competent enough, he wasn't ambitious enough to become someone who would leave a legacy other than, being a criminal and someone who killed people. So I think that legacy of him during his work in the judiciary system, as well as the 1980s in Iran, stays with me. And I'm really sad that he didn't have a just trial, and people didn't see that, the families of the victims of his time. So, but at the same time, I think a lot of those families are now sharing their happiness and kind of, at least there is some sort of justice out there, some sort of karma in their language out there for them.
Well, just finally, Negin, if, as you described there, President Raisi wasn't really seen as the real power, that is, of course, the supreme leader, Khamenei, but his succession is now perhaps a bit uncertain. Is that how you see it? I mean, is there some kind of power vacuum there as a result of this?
I think the emphasis on Raisi and Mojtaba Khamenei, the son of Supreme Leader, being the successor of the Khamenei, the Supreme Leader, it's a kind of wrong narrative in a general sense, because I don't think any of us could predict who would be the real successor. I think there is this kind of planning that is going ahead. And with Iran, there's always this kind of a battle of power that we don't know about it, because it's a really closed circuit, and they don't talk about, their names are not publicly out there. So it was really difficult to guess. And the fact that they were pushing that narrative makes me quite pessimistic about if this is the true successor. So I never could see him as a real successor, but I think they wanted to push that narrative. And I believe that doesn't change that narrative or the person who they believe should be the successor that much. I think they already planned it. There are power struggle there, and then someone would come out either way. And Raisi wasn't a big role. He might have been the face for it, but in reality, we only know who's the real successor when Khamenei actually dies.
Thanks very much, Negin. That was Negin Shiragai. Now here's Monocle's Sophie Monaghan-Coombs with the day's other news headlines.
Thanks, Chris. Taiwan's new president has been officially sworn in today. In his inauguration speech, Lai Ching-te asked China to stop its military and political threats, adding that Beijing had to respect the choice of Taiwanese people. Taiwan has faced pressure from China, which includes regular Air Force and Navy activities in its vicinity. Lai views the proudly democratic island as its own territory independent from China. South Africa's top court has ruled that former President Jacob Zuma is not eligible to run for parliament in this month's election, which could affect the outcome of the vote. Zuma had appealed the decision to disqualify him from the contest due to a law that prohibits anyone given a prison sentence of 12 months or longer from holding a seat in parliament. He was sentenced to 15 months in jail for failing to appear at a corruption inquiry. The plane maker is meeting with the Federal Aviation Administration soon, where it is expected it will present a plan to address what has been described as systematic quality control issues. Those are the day's headlines. Back to you, Chris.
Thanks very much, Sophie. Now to Georgia, where the country's president has vetoed a bill that would place restrictions on media organizations and civil society groups with foreign funding. But the country's parliamentary speaker has already promised to override that veto. If the parliament won't listen to their country's president, perhaps they'll heed a warning from the leaders of Germany and France, who expressed deep concern over the law and said it goes against European values. Well, I'm joined on the line now from Tbilisi by Georgi Tabagari, who's a civic activist and the director of Tbilisi Pride. Georgi, great to have you back on the briefing. This presidential veto was expected, but is it a positive signal for protesters nonetheless?
Yes, definitely. The veto was expected from the president, and this is something that protesters obviously expected as well. I'm not sure about the timing, though, because President had more time. It was her decision to decide to veto it right after. So she could have taken time, and there is something that we could have discussed. But I think in either way, she vetoed the thing, and now it's up to the parliament to overrule. They have enough seats to ensure that happening. But obviously, majority of Georgians, we're still hoping that they will change their mind, even though they don't show any sign of refraining from the decision.
Why did the timing matter for you, as you're suggesting there? What could have been done differently in this that might have had some kind of impact on the outcome?
I'm not absolutely certain about the choice because there are pros and cons on both sides. Maybe taking more time would have helped the situation more, even to increase the pressure. But this is a decision of the president, and she probably had her own arguments why she rushed it, even though a few days probably don't make difference. Maybe it also might be better because the atmosphere in Tbilisi is still very much on the side of the protest. People are not going to back off despite the terror and threats that they were receiving on the phones or at their homes or all over the place. So maybe it's probably also logical that she did it that way.
Well, tell us more then about the situation on the ground in Tbilisi at this point. What is the mood of protesters entering a new week of this?
The mood is definitely that no one wants to give up, and especially after the law, if it enters into the force, that will apply to so many people, civil society organizations, activists, individuals. Basically, will become nearly impossible to operate in this ecosystem of oppression and persecution by the government. We've seen how things turned out in Russia. We've seen how things turned out in Belarus. This is not like the blue sky where we navigate in a completely empty space. All of this have already happened in many places, and this is how Russia operates in the sphere of interest, where they have in basically like post-Soviet the field. So we expect that it will have a really negative impact on how Georgia operates as a country, how elections are going to be carried out. No one believes that there will be free and fair elections under the circumstances if this law is operating and if local non-governmental organizations are not able to observe elections properly or just operate in normal circumstances.
Well, I mean, given, I guess, the point there would be that, for example, there are some opinion polls suggesting that about 80% of Georgians are in favor of NATO and EU membership. So I guess in that context, to your point there, how is the government going to be able to continue and push on with these kinds of shifting winds against it?
The situation that you probably are describing now relates to something where the free and fair elections are taking place. I don't believe that at this stage, Georgian Dream government still intends to willingly give up the power that they have, because they are pushing the limits at this point. They know that they will be held responsible for the decisions that they made, violating the constitution, derailing Georgia from the constitutional clause, which is 78, which defines that the Georgia foreign policy is to integrate into EU and NATO. So all of this, they know that it will backfire, and I think they are pushing the limits, and I believe this is also the directive from Kremlin, just to derail Georgia fully from the EU integration path and create these parallel spaces where, apart from Ukraine, where the full-scale war is happening, so Russia secures different territories across its border. I mean, Georgia, Armenia, also countries in Balkans, and obviously Ukraine, Belarus, and Moldova. So all of this is happening in parallel space, and I believe this is just Russia pushing to its limits as well to take away these countries like old-style way, the same way like it was taken away in 1921 or later when the Soviet crackdown started.
And just finally, Georgi, what did you then make of Emmanuel Macron, Olaf Scholz's statements about this, talking about their grave concern that they have for this law? You've also received various visits from European ministers, the Baltic states as well. I mean, is that kind of foreign pressure likely to change anything? Is there anything else you would like to see from that foreign pressure?
If it was happening a few years ago, even a year ago, foreign pressure sort of meant always something in local Georgian politics, because up until now, State Department and Brussels always had, and different capitals, which are usually active in the foreign policy setting, always had an impact on internal Georgian policy. Unfortunately, it's no longer the case. The current leadership of Georgia do not listen to the Western partners. They alienated everyone. They don't have any other partners but Slovakian and Hungarian government. And you know what do they stand for within the European Union as well. So it is great that there is still everyone realizes in the West that they are losing Georgia basically as an ally, as a partner who was on the front line of democratic fight in the past decades, basically, in the region, and it's all just drifting away at this point. So obviously everyone is concerned in the West, but I believe the only effective thing, and I'm not alone in this, is to sanction the key figures of Georgian Dream, especially Ivanishvili, who is the Russian oligarch who is behind all this, and he has foreign assets. He is closely affiliated to Kremlin, and key figures of Georgian Dream who are openly speaking against West and making all the decisions basically, which is derailing Georgia from the Western discourse. These people need to be sanctioned. Otherwise, I don't see the value of just making standard statements of someone is being concerned about things that are happening. This is the civilizational war which is happening between Russia and the West. And unfortunately, at this stage, West needs to properly wake up and realize that this is not going to end in Georgia. It's going to be many more states that are going to take the similar path. If you just look at the legislations, how it's being promoted now in many places, same applies to foreign agents law and anti-LGBT legislation. It's all happening in the very same playbook, and this playbook is coming from Kremlin.
Georgi Tabagari, thank you very much for joining us. You are listening to The Briefing on Monocle Radio. You are back with The Briefing on Monocle Radio. I'm Chris Chermak. Now to India, where the 5th and 6th phases of an election that will run until the 1st of June are underway this week. The 5th phase marks a return of sorts to Prime Minister Narendra Modi's more nationalist roots, as it includes the Uttar Pradesh region where Modi rebuilt a temple to the Hindu god Ram earlier this year on the site of a mosque razed to the ground back in the 1990s. Let's cross over to Bangalore now to get an update from the journalist Maya Sharma. Maya, always good to have you on the show. Let's start with the polling, I suppose. What is the polling saying as we enter this 5th phase of the election? Is Modi's BJP still expected to win this thing comfortably?
You know, before the election started, before the voting actually started, there was a lot of talk about their winning more than 400 seats. This is the BJP and their allies. There does seem to have been a shift in that perception. They're not using the number 400 anymore in their campaigns. This is, of course, for the Indian Parliament, which has 543 seats. They are not discussing numbers anymore. And there seems to be a growing confidence in opposition assertions that the BJP and its allies have not done so brilliantly in the first 4 phases. That is, of course, what the opposition would like to say. But there does also seem to be a certain loosening of a loss of confidence, perhaps also in the way the ruling party is addressing rallies and the things they're talking about. It would appear, at least perception-wise, that there has been a shift from seeing the BJP's victory once again as a done deal to perhaps an element of doubt creeping in as we enter this 5th phase of voting, which is happening still at this moment.
And Maya, what do you make of that then in terms of the way that Modi has changed his own addressing of election rallies and so on and so forth? I mean, some of this, arguably, certainly the opposition would say, borders on hate speech under India's laws. But is it also, I mean, both aspects, I guess, both whether that is actually true and something should be done about it, but also are you seeing it then more now as a sign of desperation than confidence?
That is certainly how the opposition is trying to present it, that the issues he is raising do seem to be a little desperate. Voting is over in South India, and during campaigning in Uttar Pradesh, as you mentioned, in the northern part of the country, he talked about how South Indians were insulting to people from that state, to people from Uttar Pradesh. It just seemed not quite rational. He does continue with his anti-Muslim rhetoric. That does continue indeed. But other issues as well, which just don't seem to make much sense. He has, of course, talked earlier about Muslims being given priority if the Congress and its allies comes to power, if the India group comes to power. He's talked about that other castes, other backward groups would be disadvantaged because they would focus all the priorities on Muslims. Now, that has been considered as hate speech. Not that much action has been taken against such speeches, but the subjects that Prime Minister Modi is choosing in his rallies does seem to be getting a little broader, a little wider, and the opposition at least certainly views it as desperation.
So if the opposition views it as desperation, to what extent, though, to flip it to the other side, is there perhaps, I suppose, an overconfidence on the side of the opposition? They have been critical about the running of this. They've been critical about the election commission as well. I mean, is any of this really going to work for them in the polls or in convincing the electoral commission, for that matter, to kind of change tacks here?
Well, of course, exit polls are not permitted in India anymore until the end of voting. So on the 1st of June, you're going to have a rush of exit polls. So we'll which will try to predict what will be happening in the counting on the 4th. But unofficially, you know how the buzz goes around at election time. Unofficially, the opposition is saying that in the states that have voted, the BJP has lost seats. The release of the Delhi Chief Minister, Arvind Kejriwal, on bail to permit him to campaign has also been a boost for the opposition alliance. The capital, Delhi, votes this Saturday, and Arvind Kejriwal's release was seen as a kind of definite, giving some impetus to the opposition campaign. So that is another reason for their confidence. And yes, you spoke about the Election Commission not really acting on Prime Minister Modi's speeches for sure. In fact, there is an ongoing campaign, Chris, which is actually grow a spine or resign, a message being sent to the Election Commission, because it is being seen that far from taking action against hate speeches, what could definitely be defined under hate speeches under Indian law, at the most, a letter was sent to the BJP party president questioning him about Prime Minister Modi's speech. No message sent to Prime Minister Modi himself. And this really contrasts with action taken swiftly and firmly against opposition leaders who have, of course, made objectionable speeches of their own. Those opposition leaders have been pulled up and sanctioned, but Prime Minister Modi and the BJP and its allies do seem to be getting away with far more. And the Election Commission has faced petitions, it's faced official complaints from different parties, it's faced questions by civil groups. Even journalist groups have asked them for better data after voting, because right now we're just getting immediately the percentages of voting, but not the actual number, which was the practice earlier. The actual number of voters is coming after several days, giving rise to the possibility of questions of malpractice, and also asking for press conferences after each phase of voting, something that was a habit of the Election Commission, which is not being done now.
Maya Sharma, thank you very much for joining us. I'm sure we'll check in with you further as this election nears its end. You are listening to The Briefing on Monocle Radio. Now to Poland, a country with a difficult history of being handed back and forth to a degree between the Germans and the Soviet Union after the Second World War, and determined not to repeat that history. Prime Minister Donald Tusk has announced that the country will invest 2.2 billion euros in strengthening his country's eastern border with Russia and Belarus. Tusk says the plan was to make the border a safe one in times of peace and an impenetrable one in times of war. Well, joining me now is Mateusz Mazzini, who's a writer-at-large at Gazeta Wyborcza and lecturer in journalism at Collegium Civitas in Warsaw. Mateusz, always good to have you on the show. What does this so-called Shield East project, as Tusk called it, entail?
So there's very little to talk about in terms of specifics because very little has been announced so far. We only have a major outline of what the current government wants to implement in the span of few years. This might take up to 5 or 6 years to complete. It's supposed to be just a series of barriers, bunkers, fortifications, and various different forms of military installations that are supposedly meant to block a conventional invasion from the east, obviously, meaning from Russia and Belarus. But a hint of possible inspirations comes from the fact that Tusk himself has said this is supposed to be modeled on the Finnish and Baltic experiences, and we've known that for quite some time, that the 3 Baltic states have announced at the very beginning of this year that they are going to build 600 bunkers altogether along their Russian and Belarusian border. So I think this is just an extension, both politically and strategically, of the concern about the possible invasion from Russia that prevails in NATO and European Union's eastern flanks right now.
Well, and Donald Tusk also framed this as a recognition of kind of this new responsibility for Europe, as he described it. I mean, is that in a positive way, sort of a taking of responsibility, or is there also a sort of fear there that Europe and NATO are not doing enough?
Well, I think, as I said, there's very little to talk about in terms of specifics, but there's quite a lot to talk about in terms of domestic political context, because we're on the verge of the European Parliament voting in Europe right now. And for Poland, this is a particularly complicated situation, because this is going to be the 3rd time in the span of just 10 months when Poles will go to the polls. And there is very little that the current government is able to do in terms of mobilizing its own electorate, because people are just simply tired of electoral campaigns and electoral politics. So what Tusk is trying to do right now is to frame the entire discourse over the European Union, European Parliament elections in terms of national security. This is all about survival. This is all about preventing Russia from penetrating European Union, penetrating Poland, also in terms of hybrid threats. And when we talk about hybrid threats, I think it's fundamental to mention the existing wall on the border between Poland and Belarus, the one that touches upon illegal migration routes from Belarus and weaponization of the migrant traffic. And there is a major change, I think, in public discourse on behalf of the Polish government, but also civil society, also liberal media. There's very little space now devoted to the aspect of humanitarian actions, activism, helping the migrants. Even Tusk himself on a press conference a few days ago said 80 out of 100, so 80% of the cases of migrants that we're managing to intercept on the eastern border are young males. They're getting violent, they're increasingly more dangerous, and we need to maintain stable control over the eastern border. So I think it's not just about the conventional, traditional forces, either Russian or Belarusian, invading into the Polish territory, but also preventing Poland from suffering from any other form of hybrid threats.
Mateusz, thank you very much for joining us. That was Mateusz Mazzini in Warsaw. Now, finally on today's show, it is time for a review of the Latin American papers with Monocle's senior correspondent, Fernando Augusto Pacheco, who joins me right here in studio. Good afternoon, Faye.
Good afternoon, Chris.
Faye, we're going to start with something that you have been talking about also last week on some of our shows. That is the floods in southern Brazil. They are continuing. What's the latest that you can tell us?
Well, there's been quite a lot of information in Brazilian papers, but one of the headlines, Chris, is basically Brazil lost over 25 billion euros since 2015 because of floods. So that means destruction in infrastructure, people's houses. And an interesting thing I was thinking about this morning, when I grew up in Brazil, we have a lot of problems, inequality, violence, but everybody will say at least we do not have natural disasters. I personally think it's a lie, and I think Brazilians are realizing that. We always said, we never have earthquakes or cyclones, but we do have something very serious. We're seeing this in the southern state of Rio Grande do Sul, but to be fair, it happens every summer, even close to areas where I used to live, in São Paulo, in Rio de Janeiro. And just so you know how damaging it is, we do have local elections in October in the whole of the country. The governor of Rio Grande do Sul announced in an interview with the paper that maybe the state should delay those elections. We're talking here about October. So that just shows how long the process of rebuilding the state in some of the damaged cities will be as well.
Is it just the fact that this is of a different scale? I mean, is that why you would say there hasn't been this recognition in the past, and why? But at the same time, it sounds like you're saying that might change going forward, that there'll be a recognition even of the smaller disasters that do strike Brazil.
I think so as well, because before perhaps it was very localized in one small town or in a particular region. But here, as I was talking on Friday's Monocle Daily, it's practically the whole state has been affected. So, from the big city of Porto Alegre to the much smaller towns. So, yeah, it felt very much a disaster to know that such an important airport, the one in Porto Alegre, they still don't have a date when is it going to reopen. And as I said, it might take months and months. It's very serious.
Well, let's move on to one other story, Faye, from La Nación in Argentina. The Argentinian leader is in a spat with the Spanish Prime Minister's wife.
Yes, my first tip, if you are a leader of any country, do not say anything about the wife or the husband.
The spouses.
Oh, gosh. I mean, it happened with Bolsonaro and Brigitte Macron as well. But this time, in a meeting with far-right leaders in Madrid, Javier Milei called the wife of the Spanish Prime Minister, Begoña Gomez, he called her corrupt. And of course, he mentioned that because she's currently being investigated. It's a long story here in the Spanish press. But then the reaction was swift from Spain. They recalled their ambassador in Buenos Aires. The Chancellor of Spain said that this was deeply serious, and there might be other measures if Milei doesn't apologize. If he doesn't apologize, I don't know. Spain, I think, is ready to confront the situation really hard.
Is this a sign, do you know at all, if the sort of relations are quite tense between Argentina and Spain, particularly under Argentina's new leader?
Yes, it's not the first time that there are being spats among ministers. It's not the best relationship, I would say. And I was even reading an article, not necessarily related to this story, but saying that in Latin America now, even the leaders, they are swearing at each other. They're being quite impolite. I mean, we always had people from the right, from the left, but now there's a sense of rudeness in the air. And I think this is terrible when you talk about diplomacy, right? So just be careful what you say, in my opinion.
Avoid the rudeness if you can.
I hate rudeness.
Well, let's move on to something more positive to end the show with. Fernando, you have something about Brazil in Cannes this year. What have they been up to?
So Folha de São Paulo did a nice story. There's 2 Brazilian films that people are talking about. The first one, I believe it's not in competition, but is a new documentary called Lula. Guess what? It is about our current president, and it's been directed by Oliver Stone. It's not quite a new thing for Oliver Stone to do this type of things. He did films about, Fidel Castro. He does have a connection with this kind of left in Latin America. And he says in the article that the film was praised. A lot of people were clapping, but to be fair, the majority of the crowd was Brazilians. And they said that it's kind of... There's no sense of dissidence with Lula. I mean, it's basically a very pro-Lula film. This has to be added here. But yeah, so it's been a big story. And the other film is Motel Destino, which is in competition for Palme d'Or. It's going to have its first screening on Wednesday, and it could win the big award. I think it's going to be a very cool film. Sounds like my type of film, set in a roadside sex hotel. It's being described as a tropical noir where
tropical noir.
Yeah, where loyalties and desire intertwine. I love that.
Well, I mean, those will be 2 films for you to watch.
Oh,
absolutely, yes. Faye, looking forward to that, I'm sure. That was Monocle's Fernando Augusto Pacheco, and that's all the time we have for this edition of The Briefing. It was produced by Carlotta Rebello. Our researcher was George Ruskin, and our studio manager was Mariella Bevan. The Briefing is back tomorrow at the same time. I'm Chris Chermak. Goodbye, and thanks for listening.